Now, you know I've been to a lot of museums, but this is one of the few that's made me feel lightheaded. This is a true house of horrors. I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today we're going to explore one of the most macabre and downright frightening museums in all of Europe, the Fragonard d'Alfort Museum, famous for its medical écorchés, flayed humans from the 18th century. The Musée Fragonard d'Alfort, often simply the Musée Fragonard, is mostly a veterinary museum. After all, it's located on the outskirts of Paris in a prestigious veterinary university. This institution is known for its vast collection of anatomical oddities that run the gamut from two-headed calves to giant kidney stones, and we'll see some doozies. However, it is home to a lot more than just simple veterinary specimens. Owing to the work of a real-life mad scientist called Honoré Fragonard, it's also home to some truly stomach-churning human specimens preserved in classic écorché preparations, and we're going to see them all. But first, I just want to say thank you for watching and welcome back to my channel. For those of you that are new here, my channel is all about museums, the strange, the wonderful, and the sublime, and I create video tours that explore art, oddities, and artifacts. I've recently launched a Patreon, and if you head over there, you can see all of the extra content that I offer to my patrons. This month, I had a strange and wonderful walk through an old City of London church, and next month we'll be exploring the new medical gallery at the Wellcome Collection. But back to the Musée Fragonard. I really need to say that this museum should not be confused with the Musée Fragonard in central Paris. That lovely museum is all about fragrance and the perfume brand, and not formaldehyde. Instead, I'm visiting the École Nationale Vétérinaire de Maisons Alfort. I took quite a long metro to get here, to one of the world's oldest veterinary schools and one of Europe's oldest museums, but that shouldn't put you off visiting, especially if you are a sucker for the strange and macabre, like yours truly. For this video, I also spent time in the beautiful Wellcome Library in London to access a rare book on the topic. Another note that this museum is also featured in my video on the strangest museums in Paris. Actually, it takes the top spot, alongside places like the Musée des Moulages, which houses wax specimens designed as teaching aids. This is a similar institution. Veterinary students could spend time with the collection and study unusual cases, giving them a chance to view rare pathologies up close. Today, the museum consists of 3 large rooms that contain a large collection of anatomical oddities and dissections, most of which date from the 19th and early 20th centuries, but some which do survive from the 18th century, like the écorché. Nothing could have prepared me for the final room, the chamber at the back of the museum, painted in red, holding the flayed figures, or écorchés, created by Honoré Fragonard himself. He prepared more than 700 examples, but only 21 remain, and almost all are on display in this final room. Fragonard used advanced techniques of injecting wax into the veins to create these tableaus, but their scientific significance, which is really strong, is almost overshadowed by their gleeful horror. Now remember, these are real human corpses. A little bit later on, we're going to talk more about Honoré Fragonard's life, his methods, and his legacies when we get to that room in our tour. But let's start here. In the first gallery, we'll ease ourselves in with some veterinary specimens, and I'm going to highlight some of the most interesting and bizarre ones that caught my eye. Now, this horse is really actually very fascinating. It's a lot less gory than what we'll see later on. Remember, despite the very famous human specimens that the museum is known for, this is, after all, a veterinary school to this day. There's a doggy sperm clinic nearby. There's a sign for it outside. But let's just pause here and talk about how revolutionary this plastinated horse and the idea of a horse hospital in general really was. Because of course, think about it, back in the mid-1700s, horses were extremely important to society. So the Fragonard d'Alfort Museum was created at the same time as the school in 1766, making it one of France's oldest. For context, the British Museum, which I have 3 videos about and soon to be a 4th, was opened to the public just 7 years earlier. The primary purpose of the museum at the time was to document animal anatomy and pathologies for future veterinarians. But it was also entertainment, as all museums are, and we'll talk about that a bit later on. Now remember, this is also the same time, the mid-18th century, as George Stubbs in England. And now he was self-taught, both an anatomist and a painter, who was meticulously studying the anatomy of the horse, studying decaying specimens and painting them with care. His whistle jacket painting is one of the most famous paintings in the National Gallery. Here we can see another painting, A Lesson in Hippiatric Anatomy by Philippe Etienne Lafosse. And hippiatrics is the study of the treatment of disease in horses. We cannot overstate how important this was to people in Paris at the time. Of course, at the time, people weren't just painting horse anatomy lessons. There are, of course, a lot of really beautiful human anatomy paintings in the Wellcome Collection and many other medical museums and art galleries around the world. But for now, let's move on from horse anatomy. At the entrance to the museum, we can also see an écorché of a porpoise, likely carried out by Fragonard's successor here at the museum. He was intrigued by the madman's methods, but he wanted to keep the subject matter more suitable to a veterinary museum, and so some of the veterinary students brought this porpoise back from a trip to the sea. Now here, this calf, he looks pretty normal from this angle, but this is indeed a 2-headed calf. This condition, having more than one head, is known as polycephaly. It's a result of the incomplete division of a single embryo or the incomplete fusion of 2 separate embryos. They divide a little bit later than with identical twins, and as a result, the people or animals are conjoined. Of course, this happens in humans, and it also happens in animals of all kind. In animals, they are sometimes called Janus calves, as you can see here. Janus, of course, having 2 faces. In the case of livestock, most are stillborn, but according to Ripley's, the oldest living 2-faced calf did survive for 40 days. This poor guy reminds me of this poem by Laura Gilpin. So sad. Now, this museum is particularly horrified, so they don't just have a few 2-headed calves. No, this isn't a mere county fair. Instead, there are many, almost too many, examples of animals with multiple legs and heads and other teratologies. This one reminds me of a spider. I mean, look, this is a 10-legged goat. Of course, this still happens, by the way. This is an example from Australia, and the science is the same. The embryo just partially divides in a different way. Here's a 2-headed bat, which is really neat. I'd never actually seen this. And just so many mangled bodies, both taxidermized and in skeletal preparations. These shouldn't be confused, by the way, with circus sideshow gaffs. Objects that are created just for display, sewn together and then taxidermied, like a jackalope or a Fiji mermaid, which I include in my video about the strangest objects in the British Museum. And let me know if you would like a video just on the history of circus sideshows. I have actually done a presentation on that in the past. Now here is a specimen model of a deformed dog. And you can see here that the dog was called Mopsy. Some researchers believe that such deformed dogs may be the origin of today's short-muzzled dogs like pugs and French bulldogs, which is so sad when you think about it. They used to have much longer snouts. And here's this poor little ducky born without wings. One of the museum's most famous animal specimens, not human, is its Cyclops, which is this colt born with both eyes fused together, which of course forms the basis of ancient myths. In the rare chances that it happens, it's caused by the failure of the orbits of the eye to divide normally. Here's a rare cyclopic goat born in India in 2017. It actually survived more than a week, which is really rare. And look at his silly little tongue kind of sticking out the side. Now let's make our move into the next room in the museum, like a wondrous skeletal menagerie. This really reminds me of Desrolles, a famous taxidermy shop in Paris. I included it as the bonus entry in my video on the 10 strangest museums. It's like a ghastly procession of exotic animals. And as I have mentioned, due to the 18th century nature of this collection, it does mostly comprise horses and other livestock, which were the lifeblood of society, literally. After all, vets wouldn't be spending their time and effort on pets at this point in history, things like dogs and cats, very rarely, but rather on the useful working animals that drove society. So this room is quite fascinating in and of itself, with even a giraffe. But as this is a vet museum, we also have those working animals represented here as well, particularly with this very photogenic display case of horse mandibles. And here's some models of eyeballs and insects. To me, these seem to be made from papier-mâché or plaster, but let me know in the comments if you know for sure. Now, there are a lot of wet specimens in this museum. That's what we call organic materials, usually flesh, suspended in a preserving liquid, such as formalin. My old job when I used to volunteer at the Bart's Pathology Museum was repotting specimens like this. The museum displays quite a few of what they call monsters, which is certainly an old-fashioned way of referring to teratology, which is quite literally the study of monstrosities, though today we would say the study of congenital abnormalities. I have chosen not to show the human infants in these glass jars, but the museum does have some babies and fetuses, some that were stillborn and others that died after birth, suspended in liquid. Like the animal taxidermy, babies born with congenital abnormalities were often suspended in formaldehyde and shown in circus sideshows, and they were referred to in America as pickled punks. We'll see even more wet specimens as we enter the final room and look at the parasites at the end of our tour. Yuck. Wow, these preserved intestines really show you the magnitude of a horse's intestinal system. And speaking of, here's a gallstone from a horse. Now, I love this. In order to find more information about this, I did a Google image search with just this frame, and I kept getting images of these globes because they really do look alike. But this gallstone is 11.5 kilos, which is absolutely wild. That's almost 25 pounds. And this is the bronchial tree of a cow, which really resembles a tree. Now, here's some more stones. Many medical museums have displays of kidney stones. They can be strangely beautiful to some people, but not me. For me, this is just horrific when I remember what they are. Only a few things really squick me out at a medical museum, and this is definitely one. I took this photo in the Surgical Museum in Chicago a few years ago, and I guess it's a repulsive fascination. A few cat specimens as well, which were later from the 19th century. The skull of a domestic cat versus a wild cat, and an inflated cat stomach, which is much, much smaller than this massive stomach of a cow from 1896. I read a website in French that describes this as a, quote, enormous mutant pouch. How evocative. The stomach of a cow was preserved in 1896 by Eugène Petit-Colin. Petit-Colin is known as one of the masters of life molding, and many of his models have been displayed in prestigious museums, such as the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, and in many of the displays that we've seen today. Now let's have a look at this dog skeleton. I think that's a picture of him down at the bottom left. The poor thing has a bone disorder in his legs. Bone lesions. Bone lesion is like a bone tumor. The cells divide and multiply at higher than normal rates, and that creates a mass in the bone. These can be malignant or cancerous, but they are apparently extremely painful. Poor guy. As I mentioned, I've taken some time today to come to the Wellcome Collection Library in London in order to have a look at this book, Fragonard Museum, The Écorché, The Anatomical Masterworks of Honoré Fragonard by Christophe Degers. He's the perfect person to have written this book. He's actually the curator of the museum. I couldn't get the book delivered to my house in time for the making of this video, but I have ordered it since. Okay, are you ready? Here we go. We are entering into the écorché room, the third and final room, like descending into the lower levels of hell. These are the écorchés, which again mean flayed figures. Let me start by reintroducing the founder of this museum, the anatomist Honoré Fragonard. It's important that you don't get him mixed up with his cousin Jean Honoré, who was a famous Rococo painter known for his ethereal works like this one, the swing, which is housed at the Wallace Collection in London. Nor should you confuse our man with the perfume company, Fragonard, named for the painter because his father was the perfumer to the court. These two cousins, both named Honoré Fragonard, are on opposite ends of the pendulum of 18th century Paris, one fascinated with beauty and light, and the other with death and the body in its most abject state. But as we'll talk about later on, maybe they were more similar than we think at first. Now, our Fragonard was less interested with Rococo beauty and more interested in the corpse. He pioneered a preservation method called écorché, but écorché can also be used to refer to any depiction of a flayed body. These paintings, for instance, are entitled écorché. Fragonard was born in Grasse in 1732, and he died at age of 66, with a few pieces of his life's work still here today for us to admire or be horrified by. After studying surgery, in 1759 he obtained his license and was recruited by Claude Bourgelat, founder of the world's first veterinary school in Lyon. There's still a veterinary museum there that I am very keen to visit. Now, for some context, he was a contemporary of John Hunter, the Scottish surgeon and anatomist in London, who revolutionized medical lecturing during that time period. For more information about Hunter and the museum, watch my video just linked above. It's grisly, sure, but it's nothing like this. Once Fragonard started working in Lyon, he began to make his first anatomical exhibits, which were based on those of Jean-Joseph Sue. When Louis XV gave his blessing for a veterinary school in the Parisian suburb of Alfort in 1766, Fragonard served as this school's first professor of anatomy for 6 years. And that's when things started to get weird. He was famously expelled from the school in 1771 as a madman, and then his strange and wonderful, but also horrifying specimens were scattered throughout the country after the revolution, some even ending up in churches. Even after he lost his job here, though, he continued to prepare dissections in his home, gaining income by selling his works to the aristocracy. They were considered very desirable by a well-heeled upper class who wanted something truly macabre for their cabinets of curiosity. Now, in 1793, along with his cousin, remember I said they had more similarities than we might think at first glance. Both Honoré Fragonards became members of the National Jury of Arts, and in the following year, the Commission Temporaire des Arts. I think this is particularly fascinating, as you can see the intersection of science and art, the body as canvas. Towards the end of his life, he continued to champion the idea of a national anatomical museum and begin to amass his earlier life's works so that they could be displayed and people could learn from them. But he was upset when this idea did not materialize in his lifetime. Now, even though he was clearly an eccentric, he was named director of anatomy at the newly created École de Santé de Paris, but he died on the 5th of April, 1799, before his work began. Eventually, owing to the work of the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine of Paris, Mathieu Orfila, the National Museum finally came to fruition in 1844. Eventually, the Orfila Museum was merged with 2 others, but it closed for good, sadly, in 2005, and I never got to see it. Apparently, the objects are on display at the University of Montpellier, so I do need to head there. So if only 21 of Fragonard's 700 écorchés are here, where are the rest? Well, most did not survive. They were destroyed by rats and insects in museums across the country, and a handful are in other museums. My favorite example is one that ended up in a church and was believed by the nuns there to be incorruptible flesh. They didn't know that the corpse had undergone a plastination process, and so they believed the body was saintly. Let's have a closer look at the écorché, inarguably the most macabre part of the museum, and maybe of any other museum in Europe. Yes, there are the decorated skeletons of Bavaria and the dressed corpses of the so-called Church of the Dead in Urbania in Italy, but there is something so Jeffrey Dahmer about these. It's like the Von Trier film, The House That Jack Built, but it's in real life. That said, Honoré Fragonard was certainly not the first person to merge anatomy and art, as I've brought up a few times. A century earlier, Friedrich Reich, the anatomist and artist, created these really realistic depictions of the human body in really twisted and interesting ways in still lifes, along with other objects from the natural world. And this really inspired his daughter, Rachel Reich, who's one of the only female artists in the National Gallery. She also did still lifes, but of flowers. But undoubtedly her father's influence is there and here on what we're looking at. Now, while many of Honoré Fragonard's contemporaries, including Madame Tussaud, who I am preparing a video about, were creating artificial anatomy models from wax, ceramic, and plaster, Fragonard spent years preparing hundreds of these écorchés through a very difficult, and to this day quite secretive process, similar to that of plastination. Though most of the items were intended to be used as educational tools, some of this work, I mean, come on, this is purely artistic. Here's how Honoré's plastination process worked. He would carefully select a cadaver for leanness, sometimes acquiring them in ghoulish and illegal ways, and injected the vascular system with a colored mixture of wax, animal fat, and plant resins. Next, he dehydrated the body in a bath of alcohol and positioned it in a wooden framework, which held the body in his desired pose as the alcohol evaporated. Finally, everything was painted and the body was varnished. By the way, this exceptional state of preservation was only revealed in 2003 during the massive heat wave at that time, because some of them started to melt. I also want to point out that Fragonard was only successful with 6 in 10. And I shouldn't say only. This was considered a really, really good success rate. By the way, dry preparation is much, much harder than wet preparation. So a lot of people had much lower success rates. Fragonard was considered a genius with this. So Fragonard may have been a genius because of his methods, but he was definitely considered a madman because of the strange little diorama situations that he has placed the fetal, human, and animal corpses into, which tell little tales. Now, let's look at some of them more in depth. The Horseman of the Apocalypse, which is based on Albrecht Dürer's print. Here, a flayed man sits atop a flayed horse. But what makes this even more disturbing is that until rather recently, this one was surrounded by a few human fetuses that were riding sheep and horse fetuses. I'm all for the macabre, but that's downright disturbing. By the way, at the time of Fragonard's termination from the veterinary school, rumors abounded in Parisian salons that the rider here was Fragonard's fiancée, that he had done away with her and preserved her in one of his ghoulish tableaus. But all you need to do is just look between this chap's legs, and you can tell that that is just not the case. Now this one here, the man with the mandible, it's inspired by Samson attacking the Philistines with an ass's jaw. Just look at this stocky figure. He's brandishing the jawbone of a horse at us, baring his teeth beneath twisted lips, advancing upon us in a state of fury. This face, I keep showing it in the video because it's just so jarring. Even today in our media-saturated world, he is frightening, but I just want you to imagine seeing him in the 18th century. Then we have these monkeys, and 3 human fetuses dancing in a strange jig. This jig sometimes called the danse macabre, the macabre dance. So these fetuses here used to be posed along with the fetuses riding fetal horses at the base of the man with the mandible, but they've been moved into this case, and the fetuses riding the horses are off display completely, probably for the best. This head and arm, which was used as a teaching exhibit, has muscles and nerves separated, and the blood vessels are injected with colored wax, blue for veins and red for the arteries. A goat's chest, which is the dissected trunk and head of a goat, after all, remember, a veterinary museum, even though Fragonard was clearly very interested in the human form. And this human head, again, one of the most disturbing, injected with more colored wax. The animals that are here would have been exceptionally rare in Fragonard's day. A llama, which is, of course, had come from South America, and this nilgai, which is a type of antelope from India. It's especially interesting for its preparation technique. His cutaneous trunk muscle lays over top of the animal like a blanket, and the jugular vein has been filled with brown wax and then painted with blue wax. Looking at all of these objects, I've been showing them throughout the whole video, but let's just talk for a moment about the modern displays of plastinated people, the ones that are currently being made. The most famous of which is BodyWorld. BodyWorld founder Gunter von Hagens, who himself has got a reputation of being a bit of a madman, stated that his aim was to demystify the human body and provide valuable education for the masses. This is similar to what the anatomists in Europe said back in the 17th and 18th century. Von Hagens invented a preservation process which, quote, unites subtle anatomy and modern polymer chemistry. That seems wholesome enough, right? Well, not so fast. Von Hagens has been at the center of several scandals when he returned 7 corpses to China after they showed evidence of being prisoners, and he was later shown to have accepted 56 Russian cadavers without family consent. A competing exhibition called Bodies, the exhibition, which uses the same plastination technique, openly sources its bodies from unclaimed bodies in China, which can include executed prisoners. So the ethics are dodgy, to say the least, which means actually that they have more than a little in common with Honoré Fragonard. Because after all, we don't actually know who these men are or if Fragonard acquired them ethically, yet we've allowed them to be here to be gawked at for centuries. Rumor has it that Fragonard would fetch bodies floating in the Seine and illegally use them for his experiments. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Now, of course, that leads us to the ethics of displaying human remains at all. Let me know if you would be interested in a video just about the ethics of displaying human remains. Now, just before we leave this room, this back wall is covered in the largest collection of parasites in the world. Each bottle filled with something you'd be very unhappy to see in your vicinity, or, to be crass, in your toilet. Now, we're going to make our way out of the museum now, but let's just pause to look at one more human specimen on our way out. Here we can see an exploded or Beauchêne skull, a specific anatomical preparation designed for teaching and training with the bones of the skull separated for study. There's been some debate about the creator of this technique. There were actually a number of anatomists named Beauchêne, some of them related, who have been associated with this process, but recent research has attributed the creation to Edmé François Chauveau de Beauchêne. He was an anatomist, surgeon, and physician, and quite high-ranking in Paris. His technique is not as common in medical schools today, but now it is prized by collectors, and some people even make these Beauchêne skulls for collectors to buy. The Royal College of Surgeons in London holds a beautiful Beauchêne skull with a nice connection to Paris. It was prepared by Émile Desrolles, the grandson of Jean-Baptiste Desrolles, who founded the taxidermy shop that I mentioned earlier. And that brings us to the end of our tour. Well, that's the end of our tour. I hope you enjoyed, is that the right word? Experiencing this truly macabre museum with me, and I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum.